Well, exposure is generally the cause we would think of first when we consider this question. Even with an LCD on the back of the camera, things don't always go according to plan, even when you have a reasonably good knowledge of the exposure triangle. The cause of the failure has nothing to do with ISO, shutter speed, or apertures directly, but it's still an exposure issue. The failure would have occurred no matter what exposure combination was used or what exposure mode was used, manual, automatic, or program. The cause of the problem is that our camera's built-in light meter is very easily fooled. Yes, I know we think of our camera as highly sophisticated electronics, and it is up to a point, right up to the point when it lets us down. There's a simple experiment anyone can do at home, but as I've already done this, let me take you through it and share the results with you. It shows the limitations of light meters in our cameras that measure light reflected from the subject. We're going to take a black and a white card out on a sunny day, and we're going to take a picture of each of them and see what results we get. Now we can use any ISO setting, any aperture or shutter speed combination. We can use auto exposure or manual, and it's not going to have any effect on the results we're about to see. Now, although this test is going to photograph a black and a white card, it's not too difficult to think of photographic subjects that may not be entirely black or white, but would be similar in so much as they are very predominantly dark or very bright. When we're about to take a shot, our camera doesn't actually know whether we're about to shoot a black cat in a coal cellar or a white cat in a snowstorm. So let's start with the white card first. Now I've used the manual exposure, and the camera tells me that it requires a thousandth of a second at f8, and we can see the exposure pointer on the scale below, bang on target. So we're ready to take our shot, and that's what we get. Something is not quite right. The white card is well underexposed. Now we need to add more light, but that doesn't sound entirely right, does it, with a white card? We're out in the sunshine, bright sunny day, a white card, and yet we need more exposure, but that's in fact what we need. What we're going to do is add 2 more stops of light, which means reducing the shutter speed from 1,000th of a second to a 500th of a second, which is 1 stop, and then again to 250, and then we can take another shot. Now the white card has recorded as white, but the exposure scale says we're 2 stops overexposed, but we're quite clearly not. Now let's look at the black card next, and the camera says that it requires 60th of a second at f8. So let's take the shot. And we can see that the black card comes out very much the same as the white one. But of course here now we've got a drastic overexposure. So if we've got an overexposure problem, we've got to reduce exposure. But once again, at first glance it doesn't appear quite right with a black card that we should reduce exposure. But it is, and let's go ahead anyway. Let's reduce 2 stops of light to our sensor, and the way we will do that is by speeding up the shutter 2 stops from a 60th of a second to 125th, and then to 250th. Now we seem to have our black card. The exposure we required for both the black and the white card is the same. And if we stop and think about this for a moment, it's right. because the same sunlight is falling onto both cards, so the exposure should be the same for both. In fact, the exposure the camera wanted to give both the black card and the white card right at the start was wrong, as we saw. It should have been 250th at f8, but the camera was fooled. It didn't know what it was photographing. An interesting part of this experiment is the shade of grey we can see with the results in both the white card and the black card. It's in fact 18% grey, which means if we had a long card from white to black, 18 steps along, that's the grey we would see. And it's what our camera's light meter is calibrated to. And it's why we were able to get a good exposure in our video, which we called exposure, mystery, or predictable. Now these exposure issues occur mainly because our camera reads its light reflected from the subject, so the subject we frame up on can affect the exposure that's given, especially if the subject is overly light or dark in tone. Much of the time the camera copes okay, and there's a degree of latitude either way, of course. But what can make matters worse in these situations is when we are in very high contrast light or we've got a very high contrast subject. So there's going to be times when we have to step in and make adjustments to the exposure our camera is about to give. Whether we do that manually, whether we do that with auto exposure bracketing or with exposure compensation. One way or another, we need to do it.